Okay, so nucleic acids. What you need to know for right now is there's three main ones: DNA, RNA, ATP. We talked about that before. We know that these two, DNA and RNA, are all about genes, which really means they control what? What do genes control? What does DNA control? Help me out, guys. DNA codes for proteins. It controls the primary structure of your proteins. ATP, we know, is all about energy. It's our body's battery. Everything you do is powered by ATP. What process in your body makes it? What's the process in your body that makes ATP? Cell respiration. And the energy to make the ATP ultimately came from where? Where do you get energy to make ATP from? Food. That's what we eat. Nucleic acids, all of them except ATP at least, are polymers. Big, long molecules made of monomers. The monomers that make up nucleic acids are called nucleotides. What are the monomers that make up proteins called? Come on. The monomers that make up proteins. Amino acids. What are the monomers that make up polysaccharides called? Monosaccharides. Each nucleotide is made of three things. And I'm going to go to a picture to show you these things. So this is a nucleotide. It's made up of a sugar in the middle. Why is it called pentose sugar? Five what? 5 carbons. At each point, it's a carbon in those rings, right? 5 carbons. The carbons are numbered. Attached to carbon 1 is a nitrogenous base. Other than C, cytosine, what are the other 3 we might find in DNA? Cytosine, what are the other 3? Yeah. You all know this. Guanine, C and G, and thymine and adenine. And if we're talking about RNA, there's a 5th one, and that is, what's the one in RNA that's not in DNA? It's called, boy, that's terrible. Uracil. That was a C. I went a little crazy there. Uracil. And then regardless, over here on the 5th carbon is the 3rd part of the nucleotide, which is phosphate group. What does that mean about a nucleotide if it's got a phosphate group in it? What have we said lots of times about phosphate groups? What do they make molecules be like? They got a lot of oxygen in them, so say again, Christina? They make them be polar. So these nitrogenous bases are polar. That's a nucleotide. A nucleic acid, like DNA or RNA, is made of chains of these things, sometimes multiple chains. DNA, we're not going to get into any detail on DNA today because when we get to genetics, we'll spend 4 or 5 weeks talking about it. But the word DNA stands for deoxyribonucleic acid. We've said over and over again that its job is to code for proteins. It's like the blueprints for a house. Sometimes a lot of teachers like to call it the $1 million blueprint. If you paid an architect to draw you $1 million blueprint, where are you going to keep it at? You're going to keep it locked up. Your DNA stays locked up where? In the nucleus, inside the nuclear membrane, right? Inside the nuclear envelope. But if it's a blueprint, you need it to build something, right? So you're probably going to have like a cheap, less expensive copy of it that you actually take out to the job site to build the building or whatever, right? What is the cheap, less expensive copy of DNA? RNA. All right, we know that DNA has a double helix shape. In DNA, the sugar, remember nucleic acids are made of a sugar, a phosphate, and a nitrogenous base. The sugar is deoxyribose. It's one of those 5 carbon sugars that we just saw a picture of. These are the nitrogenous bases that we just mentioned, A, T, C, and G. And I'm sure you've all heard over and over again that DNA is a double helix. It's this shape. It's made of 2 strands of nucleotides. And what holds those 2 strands together are hydrogen bonds between the nitrogenous bases. Now hear me on this. What did we just get through saying about nitrogenous bases that makes that last statement possible? They're polar. What kinds of things can make hydrogen bonds? Polar things. So that phosphate group, among some other things, makes them polar, and therefore they can bind to each other. So there's a picture of DNA. And what you ought to be able to see is that this is supposed to be a phosphate group. So this is phosphate, sugar, base. And then here's the next nucleotide. Phosphate, sugar, base. Here's another one. Phosphate, sugar, base. So it's made of 2 chains of nucleotides. RNA, we're not going to say much about today. RNA stands for ribonucleic acid. There's 3 main types that we'll deal with in this class. There are some others, but that's the M, the T, and the R. We're not going to get too much into those today. RNA's major function is that right there. It acts as a messenger between DNA and the ribosomes. It's a portable copy of the DNA. DNA is in the nucleus, but the factories for making proteins are not. So RNA is like the go-between. It's the go-between between DNA and the ribosomes. Now there are some differences between DNA and RNA in terms of the way they're made. Instead of being a double helix, RNA is a single helix usually. It's a single strand. Just 1 strand of nucleotides. And also, unlike DNA, it can leave the nucleus and it'll go out to usually the rough ER or other ribosomes out there in the cytoplasm. It's not stuck in the nucleus. It can leave. Another difference is that the sugar in RNA is slightly different than the sugar in RNA, and that's why the names are different. The sugar in RNA is ribose. The sugar in DNA is deoxyribose. They're similar though. The nitrogenous bases are all the same except for one. Instead of having thymine, RNA has uracil. It's very similar in structure, but it's A, C, G, and uracil instead of thymine. And the other thing that I want to mention in terms of nucleic acids is ATP. And we'll spend just a couple of minutes talking about ATP. Let everybody get what they need off here first. So there's RNA. It's made of phosphate group, sugar, nitrogenous base. That's a nucleotide. Here's another nucleotide. Here's another nucleotide. And there's another nucleotide. So nucleic acids like RNA and DNA are made of chains of nucleotides. monomers together make up polymers. A little bit about ATP. Its name stands for adenosine triphosphate. Unlike the other nucleic acids that we talked about, it's not a polymer. It's made of a single monomer, a single nucleotide. So it's a smaller molecule. It's not all that big. The sugar found in ATP is ribose, just like RNA. And what's the nitrogenous base? Think about the name. What's the nitrogenous base? Adenine, A, right? Adenine, same one that's in DNA and RNA. Its function is all about energy storage. We know that. And hopefully you also know that it's made during cell respiration. Most of it is made in the mitochondria, at least in eukaryotes. Cell respiration's job is to take energy away from your food and put it into the bonds of ATP so that we can power everything that we do. So those are the main things you need to know right now for ATP. Its name, it's a single nucleotide, it's not a polymer, its sugar's ribose, its nitrogenous base is adenine, and it's made during cell respiration in the mitochondria. There's a couple pictures I want to show you, and then we'll go from there. All right, so here's a picture of ATP. Here's the sugar, so that's ribose. Here's the nitrogenous base, which we said was adenine. It's triphosphate because it has 3 phosphates. Now what we're doing right here in this reaction, going this way, ATP is being broken down. What's the word for reactions to break things down? Hydrolysis. So ATP is being hydrolyzed. When you break bonds, typically what happens? It's the energy. It's released. So when this bond, and usually the only bond that's broken is that last bond there. That's where most of the energy is stored in ATP, is that last bond. When it's broken, that releases energy. That energy can be used to do something else. I want you to think of ATP sort of like a rechargeable battery. I thought I had another picture up there. Typically the way it works, we get hydrolysis of ATP. That hydrolysis is going to break ATP down into what we call ADP and P. That's when we're using the ATP. That's when ATP is providing energy to make something happen. But on the other hand, I want you to think of ATP sort of like a rechargeable battery. Up here it's charged. Now its energy is being used up. ADP and P are like the dead battery version of ATP. Dead, but what? Dead, but rechargeable. And what's the process that recharges your batteries, literally? Cellular respiration. So over here we're going to get cell respiration. And cell respiration is going to take energy from food, and it's going to put these two things back together, ADP and P, to make ATP. So this would be hydrolysis, and this would sort of be condensation over here, right? Breaking apart, putting back together. When we get to cell respiration, we'll get a lot deeper with that. Questions? Last thing we want to talk about that will be on this particular test is water. We'll talk about that in just a second. Let's do this first. First thing I want you to think about with water. Water is really unique. Whenever scientists look for life, like on other planets, for example, like on Mars, the first thing they look for is water. Water is held together, the molecule, by covalent bonds between oxygen and hydrogen, right? Water has this unique shape. What is that shape called? Looks sort of like a V. It's called bent. That's the actual scientific name for that shape, bent. The shape turns out to be pretty crucial. Because what do we know about oxygen? What have I told you to always think when you hear oxygen? Well, yeah, what makes it be polar? It's what? Because of its location in the periodic table, oxygen is electronegative. So it's sharing electrons with hydrogen. But does it share them equally? Nope. It tries to pull them closer to itself, which means that this oxygen becomes a little bit negative because it's pulling electrons close to it. Remember, that's sigma. It means a little bit negative. And the hydrogen's electrons get pulled away from them, so they become a little bit positive. So water has a distinct negative end and a distinct positive end. And what do we call things like that? No, not so much antipathic, just polar. They have ends. That's what polar means, right? They have sides. It has a positive side and a negative side. It's polar. Because of this, if two water molecules get near each other, what's going to happen? Two waters get near each other, they're going to stick together, right? Because this negative is going to attract what? It's going to attract the positive part of the other water. And this little bond that I'm showing right here there is what kind of bind? A bind between polar molecules is a hydrogen bind. What's the fancy term for between? What prefix means between? Inter. So sometimes we'll call a hydrogen bind an intermolecular force because it's between molecules, right? It's a force between molecules. Compared to this covalent bind, right in here. Is this hydrogen bind stronger or weaker than that covalent bind? Hydrogen bind stronger or weaker than covalent bonds? Help me out here. Way weaker. This bind right here is an intramolecular force. It's where? What's intra mean? Inside the molecule. They're strong. These bonds between water molecules, on the other hand, hydrogen bonds, are intermolecular, kind of weak, not very strong. But there's a lot of them in a cup of water or in an ocean of water, right? So they add up. Whenever you think about water, the two things that make it unique are its shape and its polarity. They're responsible for just about everything water does. Shape and polarity. For example, you were supposed to write that essay about water, and a lot of you didn't do a very good job on that, by the way. I'm going to give those papers back in a minute. And you're supposed to talk about different properties of water. Let's first of all talk about one of the most important properties of water. It's called the universal solvent, which means water will do what? What's it mean to be a solvent? It'll dissolve just about anything. But it's best at dissolving what kinds of things? Polar or ionic things like salts. It'll dissolve just about anything, but it's best at dissolving other polar things, salts, ionic. And the reason it's so good is that if you put something with a charge, like a salt, we know salts are like that, right? They've got ions in them. What happens when this sodium gets near an oxygen in the water molecule? What's that oxygen going to do to that sodium? What do we know that oxygen has on it? Negative charge. What's negative oxygen going to do to positive sodium? Attract it. What's positive hydrogen going to do to negative chloride? Attract it. And eventually, so many waters are going to surround this sodium chloride that they're going to do what? Pull it apart. And when it gets pulled apart, what just happened to that piece of salt? It just dissolved. So water is a really good solvent. It's best at dissolving polar things and salts. Why is that important in biology? That it's a good solvent. That was part of that essay. Why is it important that water is good at dissolving things? You're made of 70-something% water, right? Yeah, if you're gonna be able to transport things in your body's mostly made out of water. Your blood is mostly made out of water. If you want to be able to transport nutrients and oxygen and food and all those kinds of things, they better be able to dissolve in what? Water. Works the same for plants. Plants have to transport nutrients from the ground all the way through their bodies. Water does that for them. So it helps all organisms transport materials. Because if they won't dissolve in water, you probably can't transport them. Another thing that water will do is that water has what's called capillary action. And what this is, and let me just give you a definition first. It's when a polar liquid will rise in a polar tube. Capillary action. Polar liquid will rise in a polar tube. Polar things like each other, right? Polar things want to be around each other. How many of you have been to the doctor and been stuck with one of those little lancet things on the finger, and then they took those little glass tubes and they held it up there? And what happened to the blood? It like shot into the tube. Why? It's not like your blood pressure is like shooting it out, right? Because if that was the case, you'd just be hearing me spraying blood all over the place. Okay? It's not the blood pressure that does it. Why does the polar liquid rise in the polar tube? Well, let me back up a minute. Your blood is mostly water, right? So it's polar. And that glass tube is also, guess what? Polar. So when you put them together, what happens? They go in. That's capillary action. Where in biology would that be really, really important? That's how water first gets into what part? The roots of a plant. The roots of a plant are polar. As they get around water, it gets pulled in. It gets pulled in water.
You said when a polar substance gets drawn up.
Rises in a polar tube. A polar liquid rises in a polar tube. Capillary action. Another really important one is that water has what's called a high specific heat or a high heat capacity. Those are slightly different things, but we're going to define them together. Basically, they both have to do with this. That to change the temperature of water, what do you have to do? Is water easy to heat up or hard to heat up? It's hard, okay? It takes a lot of heat added to or taken away to change the temperature of water. That's what a high heat capacity or high specific heat means. It takes a lot of heat, either added to or taken away, to change the temperature of water. If you put some alcohol on the stove, and that's a bad idea because alcohol is flammable, but if you did, and you turned it on, and right beside it you put exactly the same amount of water and turned on the stove, you put a thermometer in both. The alcohol is going to get way hotter, way faster. Before the water even gets good and warm, the alcohol is probably evaporated. It's gone. Why is that important in biology? That it takes a lot of heat to change the temperature of water. You're mostly made out of water.
It doesn't evaporate.
Well, not so much evaporate. When you go outside on a really cold day, since you're mostly made out of water, it takes a long time for you to cool off, right? It helps to maintain, it acts kind of like antifreeze in your car. It helps to maintain your temperature. If you go outside on a really hot day, it takes a long time for your body to heat up because you're mostly made out of water. That's like a coolant. It's sort of like what part of your car? What part of your car acts that way for you? Keeps it cool?
Air conditioning.
Yeah, I'm talking about for the engine. What part of your car keeps the engine from getting too hot, too cold? The radiator. Okay? Sort of like what water acts for you. It acts as it keeps you cool on hot days. It keeps you warm on cool days.
So, the high to the heat is that it takes a lot to
A lot of heat added to or taken away from water for its temperature to change.
And high heat capacity.
We're defining those together. It's the same thing.
Okay.
They're slightly different things, but we're going to define them together. Another reason that's really important in biology is this. In a body of water, what does that mean about the environment in a body of water? It means it's pretty constant, right? The temperature here in Alabama might be 80 degrees one day, and then it might be 20 the next, right? The air temperature. But does the temperature of, say, the county lake, does it change that way? So that makes it easier for things living in the water, right? They're not exposed to the quick temperature changes that things on land are exposed to because of water. Anybody ever been to like LA, Hollywood? I went out there in the middle of July. I've never been out there. I was thinking California, July. I think it's going to be hot. So I had to go to a meeting, so I took a suit. But other than that, I took like short sleeve shirts and shorts. And I went outside at night in Hollywood. And it was cold. I mean, it was like 50. Why? It's by the ocean. And as hot air comes over that ocean, what does it do? What does the ocean do to that hot air coming toward LA? It absorbs the heat out of the air. And the temperature of LA is pretty much the same all year long, right? Because it's surrounded by water. Some places near the oceans have more constant temperatures than places far away from a body of water. They help to keep the temperature fairly constant and fairly moderate. Another important thing about water is that it expands as it freezes, which means I sweat. If water expands as it freezes, that means ice will be wet that it shouldn't do. It floats. Because as water freezes, it becomes less wet, less dense. It means ice floats. And the reason for that is when water forms ice, the water molecules get pushed further apart when they form crystals, when they form ice crystals. If there's more space, that means it takes up more what? What does density measure? Density is what over what? Mass over volume. So if the water molecules get pushed further apart when ice is formed, that increases what? They get pushed further apart, what does that increase? The volume. If you got the same amount of mass, but now more volume, what has to happen to the density? It has to go down. Ice floats. In biology, why is it important that ice floats? Yeah, if you're some kind of animal living in the water, it gets really cold, the top of the pond freezes. It floats. What does it do to the rest of the water underneath? What does that coat of ice on top do to the rest of the water underneath? It protects it, it insulates it. If on the other hand, ice got more dense when it got cold, like most things, it would sink, right? So a big hunk of ice would form, it would sink, and it would hit things on the way down. But then the top would freeze again, right? Sink, freeze again, sink, freeze again, sink, and pretty soon what you got? A completely frozen body of water. Are you going to find completely frozen bodies of water very often? Even in really cold places, like say Minnesota, What's Minnesota famous for?
Snow.
What's like its nickname for the state of Minnesota? The land of like 1,000 lakes. You got lakes, 10,000 lakes. You got lakes all over the place. It gets really cold in Minnesota. But how many of those lakes do you think you're going to find frozen completely solid all the way through? Very few, because of this. This helps to protect things that live in the water. The other one that we'll mention here is the surface tension. Surface tension. What is surface tension? Water sticks to water, right? What do we call that? Water sticking to itself. Anything sticking to itself is called cohesion. So the water molecules on the surface of the water stick together. So something really light, for example, what can that surface tension do? Since you got forces on top, water sticking to water, that surface tension can support certain things on the top, right? You've all seen those little water striders, those little spider-looking things that go across the top of the water? They just kind of sit there. They float. A lot of that has to do with surface tension. The surface tension of the water can support things.
So surface tension is
The idea that the water is sticking to water, cohesion, and that force can support things on top of the water. Let me mention one other thing, and we'll talk briefly about the test. It's not up here on the slide, but you need to know a little bit about it. Water has what's called a high heat of vaporization. High heat of vaporization. That means you got to add a whole lot of heat to do what? To make it evaporate. Why is that important in biology? When do you make water evaporate?
when you sweat.
When you sweat. And when it evaporates, what does it take with it? Heat away from your body, right? So water absorbs a lot of heat, and then it evaporates, and it takes that heat away from your body with it. That's why sweat works. Sweat works because water has a high heat of vaporization. It has a high heat of vaporization because before it will evaporate, enough energy has to be absorbed to break what? What makes it evaporate? What gets broken when it evaporates? Which bonds? The hydrogen bonds between the water molecules. All these properties that we talked about are due to the fact that water is what? When you hear water, you need to think water is polar and it forms what? Hydrogen bonds. All those properties, except for it expands as it freezes, are due to the fact that water is polar and it makes hydrogen bonds. Turn this off. And I decided